Thanks for being with us on a weekday evening. I'm sure you all have struggled to manage to take out some time for us. Thank you so much. We will begin our interview in about 2 minutes. Before that, I would just make a request. What we're doing today is we're keeping the audios and the videos of the audience, of the participants off, so that we can have the videos and the audios of only the speakers, which is Jerome, Justin, and I. So thanks for your cooperation. Thanks a lot. We will have a question answer session in the last 15 minutes where you can send out your questions to us on the chat and we ask Jerome your questions. We also have some questions that some of you have submitted to us in advance. So we will be asking those questions as well. Thank you so much, and we start our session now. So thanks, Jerome, for joining us today. It is a delight to have you here. And it is absolutely magical how, storytelling is bringing us all together. To begin with, Justin and I got together for our passion of storytelling. And now we've been working together and conducting workshops and sessions on storytelling. And now we have you here, far, far away, oceans apart. And we sit together here to talk about storytelling and business storytelling. It is absolutely a great experience. The way I come from a finance background, and I see that you come from a finance background too. Yeah. And then you moved on to into film production and now storytelling. That I'm sure it was quite a journey. Why don't you take us through your journey and your experience with Narativ? We would love to hear that.
Happy to. I'd be happy to. And thanks for making this happen. And thank you everyone who was able to make it. I see that someone is dialing in from New Jersey. I just spoke to someone before this who was in New York for 10 years. So clearly there's some connections, many connections with the US, I suspect. And I think, just to reflect on what you were saying, Shruti, it is always amazing to me that, no matter what our cultural backgrounds are, where we come from, where we live, even, and especially now with technology, technology is really supposed to connect us. And what we're finding is that it's sort of falling short on the human level. And I think what you just spoke to is the reality that storytelling is really what connects us. I mean, we all have a story. The minute we're born, we have a story. And then when we die, our story ends. But actually, our story continues because people tell stories about us after we die even. We tell stories about our grandparents, great-grandparents, and how they came to this country, for example, those kinds of things. And just now what you've asked me is another thing that connects us. Where do I come from? What has been my journey? Everyone has a story about their journey. And so I'll tell you a little bit about my journey and what brought me here today. Essentially, yes, you're right. My background is in finance. I grew up in France. I don't know if you knew that, but I'm half French and half American. And when I was in France, I don't know how it works in India, but in France, when you are 16 years old, you have to decide whether you're going to be a lawyer, a doctor, a journalist, an artist, whatever it is that you want to be doing. You have to have decided. And then you sort of go on a track in high school that will take you to that sort of goal that you've stated for yourself. And at 16 years old, I was, like many, didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I chose a track that was business. That's where my father came from. He was, the head of a big supermarket chain in France. And so that was my background. And so I went into this field. And at 18, I graduated from high school, and then I went into business school. And then I went into a job in finance that took me to Hong Kong for 5 years. And then this memory came back to me when I was about 22 years old, and I was living in Hong Kong, and my contract was almost coming to an end, and they were going to renew it. They had made me an offer. And I had this memory of sitting in high school, actually, when I was 16 years old. And actually, no, I was 18 years old, sorry. And my friend, Eric, next to me, this was a Spanish class, and we used to always just talk in Spanish class. And so my Spanish is not very good today. And so we would talk, and most the things we would talk about would be films and movies. And one day he told me, what are you going to do when you graduate from high school? And I said, well, I'm going to go to business school. And he said, oh, I'm going to go to film school. I said, wow, film school. And then a few, weeks later, it was the end of the year, and my mother came back from a parent-teacher association meeting. And she told me, oh, Jerome, your grades are great. You're going to graduate with flying colors. And it's so great that you're going to business school, because that's really the track for you. All your teachers agree. And I didn't say anything. And then she said to me, oh, and I ran into Eric's mom. And I again, I didn't say anything. I said, you'll never guess what she told me. She's really upset. And at this point, I couldn't feel the saliva in my mouth. There was no more anymore. I had a knot in my stomach. And she said, he's going to go to film school. And she's really upset about this because he's so good at math and all the science, curriculum. And she just thinks that it's a waste of time. And then she took a beat and she said, well, thank God you're not going to do anything like that.
Oh my God.
So fast forward, I'm now in a career in finance. I've been there for 5 years, and I've got this memory. And I type into my Google search engine 3 things at work. I typed in film, business, and New York. I had a sister who lived in New York at the time, and I visited her a couple of times. So I typed in those 3 things. And then about another few weeks passed, and I went into my boss's office, and I told him, Lawrence, I quit. And then I'm in New York City, and a few more things happened until I met Murray Nossel, the founder of Narativ, this company who also happens to be an Oscar-nominated filmmaker. And so I became his production manager for his documentary films, mostly. And then he told me about Narativ and this company that he'd created, and he told me about storytelling and how it could be used in business and other fields, many other fields. And we partnered together to create programs specifically for businesses. That was now 15 years ago, actually. And since then, I became the CEO of Narativ, and now I run training programs all over the world. And recently did an online workshop that you both participated in, and that's how we started this conversation. And now here we are.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Jerome, you talked about deciding what your career line would be at the age of 16 or 18. In India, our parents decide for us what we're going to at the age of 5. And usually you've got to become either a doctor or an engineer. And so when I got into advertising, my father, until the end of my advertising career, didn't know really what his son was doing. So
Yeah. And that's the other thing, right? It's the stories that get passed on. So our parents have stories about themselves and about what they would have liked to have done, and then they pass on some things to their children for what they would like them to do. That's again another kind of universal thing. And I think it's for me, what's really powerful about storytelling is when you find your own story. And you find, and what we do at Narativ is simply providing the tools, and what I understand you do as well, is providing the tools for people to find that story, craft that story, and tell that story. That's, so many times people are hesitant to even just go to their story, especially in the business world. We think that, we have to stick to the script, stick to the PowerPoint, and that's all I'm going to talk about. And as a result, we're not bringing much of ourselves to the presentation or to the material. And what I've found is that what's most effective and engaging as a listener, when I'm listening to someone pitch to me or present to me or talk to me about what they do, what I'm actually looking for is, who are you and why should I trust you? And why, because that's what's going to make me care about the product or the service that you're selling me, or the company that you're leading, and what you want me to do with that company. And so the story, that's where that comes in for me, is the moment that you can find a link between yourself and what it is that you do and what you're talking about. Then you struck gold. if you found that link and it has something to do with your own experience, your life experience. And you can just, start by just telling a very short story about yourself if you're not so confident, that you can tell a story during the entire presentation, but rather, just bring yourself in a little bit into that presentation. To me, that's where it starts. And I think the more we can do that, just like we started this conversation, now there's a connection that we have. I said something about having to choose when I was 16, that brought something up for you, Justin, and so as a result, you shared something with me. To me, storytelling is about dialogue. It's about connection. It's not about the perfect presentation or the perfect pitch. It's really about, am I connecting with my audience? Because if you have the perfect pitch and the most beautiful presentation, if you're not connecting with your audience, guess what? It's not going to land and they're not going to buy your product.
That's beautiful, really. That's fascinating. And that's the more natural way to go, isn't it? I mean, and it's just going the opposite direction of the PowerPoint style of doing things.
Yeah.
I've noticed that narrative places a lot of importance, like you said, on listening. I always thought that storytelling was a unidirectional thing, but you're talking of listening, which really makes it a dialogue, like you said. So so can you tell us a little bit more about this whole
Sure.
listening as a tool, please?
Yeah. Well, so I didn't talk much about the company Narativ and where we sort of came from, but how I got to it. The company existed before I joined, and it was really founded on the belief that there's a reciprocal relationship between listening and telling. Now, what that means is that the way you are listening to me right now, and even the people on this Zoom, even though I can't see them or hear them, I can see their names, I can see how many there are, et cetera, and I can see a little bit of the chat. It's informing the way I'm speaking. It's shaping how I'm speaking. And it's reciprocal because how I'm speaking is shaping how you're listening to me. And it's this constant kind of loop between listening and telling. And so that's why we place so much emphasis on listening first, before we even talk about storytelling, before we try to even get to a story. We first have to pay attention to listening, because what happens is that there's many obstacles that get in the way of our ability to listen to other people and our ability to listen to ourselves. And if you're not able to listen to yourself, then again, your story is not going to come out, or it's not going to be an authentic story. It's not going to be the relevant story that you need to tell. So we pay a lot of attention to listening and kind of helping people find ways to address what's getting in the way for them. And we even have, categories of obstacles to listening. And I'm just noticing, because of where I am, I'm outside, and I decided, oh, well, I'll do this outside for a few reasons. One, it's nice, but also I have a 4-year-old and a baby inside. So it's quarantine here in the US, it's locked down, so we don't have offices. But, so that's one of the things that I decided to do. As a result, one of the things that might be getting in the way is just the ambient sounds that come with being outside. And that's our first category of obstacles to listening, is the external, right? And then we have 4 others, and I won't go through all of them, but that's sort of, that's where we come from, is sort of looking at what's informing what I call listening environment, and how can I address all of these obstacles, or at least be aware of them, so that they're not going to get in my way when it's time for me to find the story and share my story. And that way, the more you do that, the more attuned you become to your own listeners, right? Because we're all the same. We're all human beings. And what happens to my listening probably happens to your listening. The biggest obstacles to our listening are internal, all the things that happen in our mind, the mind chatter, things we're thinking about. I'm sure it's happening right now for a lot of people. There's a lot of things that you have in your mind of, what am I going to do next? What am I going to do before? Did I turn off the oven? Did I do this? Did I do that? Is my phone off? What's happening to my phone? All these things. And so the more you're aware of that, the more you're aware of the fact that this happens to everyone. And so when you are about to tell a story, it's very important to not only be aware of that, but also communicate to your audience and your listeners that you know this about yourself and others, that you're going to pay attention to listening, right? And you're even going to ask for their attention because everyone is responsible for the way they listen, right? So in our workshops, we always do this. We always ask people to go through an exercise that will identify their obstacles to listening, but also that will sort of bring home this message that you're responsible for your listening. I, as a speaker, am not responsible for that. We often think of listening as passive. You know, we have ears, so we just hear what's going on, and that's all I have to do. Actually, you really have to work to listen, and that's on you to listen, because it's gonna shape how I speak. It's gonna inform everything I say, how you listen to me. So this is a way of putting the pressure off of the teller and really onto the listener, so that the listeners become very aware of their responsibility when it comes to storytelling, that if someone is telling them a story, it's a big thing that someone decides to do. And so as a result, as a listener, you have to respect that and bring your full listening to them, so that their story is really, as good as it can be.
I find it fascinating that we're using a powerful tool like listening, which has for the longest time been already used in coaching, and more recently in the whole area of mindfulness.
Yes. Yeah.
One of the questions that you start with I've noticed with your workshop participants, and I'm sure with your clients too, is this whole thing of why story, why now?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
Can we talk around that a little bit, please?
It's kind of the first thing you have to think about. So you think about listening, and what's getting in my way of my ability to listen. But even before you do that, if you're thinking of telling a story, or if you've told a story many, many times, especially in a business setting, if you're a leader of a company, maybe there's a go-to story that you have, an origin story, something to rally everyone together, to unify the message of the organization. And the danger there is that you've told a story so many times that it may become a little bit less engaging to you. And so the whole purpose of the story may not be so clear after a while. And if you don't have a story, and you don't yet have a purpose for telling a story, then it's going to be very difficult to find a story and tell a story. So for us, the whole question, why story, why now, is a question that we ask ourselves all the time. If I'm about to go into a meeting with someone, if I'm about to lead a team into something, if I'm going to run a workshop, whatever it is that I'm going to do, and I feel there's an opportunity to tell a story, then the first thing I have to ask myself is why? Why am I telling a story? Especially, why for this audience? And I try to find an intention that's relevant not only to me and my material, but also to my audience. And then the why now creates a sense of urgency. Why do I need to tell that story right now? And sometimes, if you can't come up with an answer, then it may mean that you don't actually need a story. Because maybe your answer is more like, well, this is the 15th consecutive week that I have a meeting with the CFO. And now we're finally going to look at the spreadsheet that tells us, how our bottom line is doing. Maybe it's not time for a story yet, But asking yourself that question will help you identify whether it's time for a story, and then maybe what kind of story might you tell if you ask yourself, why am I doing that, to begin with? So that's why we ask that question.
That's great, because that takes away the pressure of, every time that you go into a meeting to say, like, what story am I going to say?
Yeah.
So it's good to ask yourself that question.
Yes. Yeah. Because even if because that again, the danger is that if the answer is, what story am I going to say? Oh, I'm not sure. Oh, I'll just tell the story that I always tell. Then, that's just because you feel the need to tell a story, but is it really good for your audience? If it's something that they've heard 10 times before, maybe it's time for something new or just something else.
Yeah. Wow. So we've known that stories have been around for a very, very long time, and have been around forever for that matter. And as Indians, we have experienced stories through epic, through folklores, and we kind of believe that stories are embedded in our culture. It's like in our blood. And we have also experienced the fact that stories have taught us a lot of things. We use a lot of storytelling for children because it works like magic for them. Uh, but do you really think that storytelling is not used enough in the business setup? And what is your experience of, using storytelling as a tool and implementing it as a technique in various
Mm.
corporates that you've been a part of?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, the first part of the question, I do think that, it's interesting. When I started out with Narrative, we would go around and, with our connections and in business and pitch them essentially on this. And many people scratched their heads and wondered, storytelling, isn't that for children? Isn't that, for something else, for art?
True.
And,
Mhm.
and so we had to kind of explain why storytelling was so effective, could be so effective in a business setting. And then in the last 10 years, well, maybe a little bit less than 10 years, we no longer have to explain. It's become very much, here in the US, very much part of the corporate language, that everyone needs to tell a story. You need to tell a story about your brand. There's so many things, the story of the brand, the story of the company, the story of the message, the advertising, etc. It's very much part of it. And so, you know we now see that, and yet there's a definition of story that's kind of missing to me, and that I'm not seeing enough of. So I would say, to the first part of your question, I don't see storytelling, this kind of storytelling, enough in the business setup. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about, which is the second part of your question, in terms of our experience with corporations. Our definition of storytelling, as you might have noticed from the story I told, is that, and that, that came from your listening, that you asked me about my journey. And then I told you about my personal journey of how I came to being in this business. And that's essentially what we teach people to do, is to find the personal connections that they have with their business and their message and their brand, etc. And the problem is that there's another definition, or there isn't really a definition, and so everything is a story suddenly. And so, you look at a furniture store. I was walking down the street in New York, and there was a furniture store that said every chair has a story. Now that might be true, and because it comes from somewhere, it's been built, and that's what they mean, right? But the thing is that when it comes to human beings and people in business, what I'm looking for is not necessarily, the rosy picture of, how great our business is and how it's just always been going up, and that I've always been part of that journey. That's simply, I look at that and I don't see that as authentic, because it's just not true. There's no human being or business that just keeps going up. There's ups and downs. That's what life is like. And that's the opportunity with storytelling. Rather than someone else, especially in business, someone else telling a story about your business and saying, well, that's not true. That business hasn't always been great. And, there have been many downs, and let me tell you about those negative things, and I'll blog about it, right? And there's about 10,000 other bloggers who'll do the same thing. Rather, you have an opportunity in a business to take control of that narrative and to tell it as authentically as possible, with all the ups and downs, right? I could have told you, in my story, part of it was that I couldn't find a job in film in New York City. And then I had to move to find an internship. And then I had to go from paid internship to free internships, non-paid internships for 3 months. And that's how I met Murray, and because he gave me a 3-month unpaid internship. But that led me to where I am now. But that was definitely a down and a low for me. So that's something that I can construct my story around. But then I can control the narrative in terms of where I want that to end. I'm not going to end it in that sort of low, negative, down space. I'm going to end it in a high place. I became CEO. I went from intern to CEO. But if I just told you I went from intern to CEO, you'll be like, oh, good for you, But if I tell you the story of how that happened, it's like, oh, okay, now I relate, because I can see things in my mind, and I can understand the human experience. So that's kind of, how we pitch that. And then in businesses, it's interesting. We have a long-standing client with Prudential, the big financial insurance company, which I think is all over the world. And, I worked with one executive, and he had their whole the why story, why now, for them was about financial wellness. And so they were looking at, the financially vulnerable, people who have jobs, who, have function in society, have an apartment, etc., pay their rent, but they're just one paycheck away from being homeless or not being able to buy food, even though they are functioning members of society, which sadly, with the coronavirus now in the US, there's a huge crisis about to happen. But that has happened, but it's about to get worse because of that, because there are so many people that are just on the fringe. And Prudential recognized this a couple of years ago, and they started to ask the question, how can we help? How can we make sure that people who are in those situations, their employers can be equipped with the financial tools to help them get on, a retirement plan, get on a savings plan, not even a retirement, but just a savings plan. And so this was their message. And so he was looking for a way to make that more relatable and to bring himself into it. So I asked him, well, is there something in your experience that relates to this topic? And he thought about his father, who had an accident on the job. He was a warehouse worker, and he had always provided for his family. He sent all of his kids to university, very expensive, and then he coached them in basketball. Many of them got scholarships in basketball, and he had a business of his own. And then he had an accident, and as a result, he couldn't work anymore. And he had $0 in his retirement account, and he was 55 years old. And so he told, Matt is his name, he told that story throughout his presentation. But when he said that his father had $0 in his bank account, he said 100 million Americans today have $0 in their retirement account, zero, which means that they're not ready for retirement, no matter how old they are. So that point really became very, very clear because of that personal story that he told about it. And that's what we try to do. We try to take data points and look for what are the essential data points that we can, put on a story arc that makes sense for your audience, and then find a story that really brings that to life. And once you've got that story, your father doesn't have to have had an accident on the job. You can find pretty much any story that is either about your financial wellness or somebody else's financial wellness that in your own life, because money touches everybody. And so, this is what we look for. We look for these big themes, health, money, family. These are often the underlying emotional kind of values that underlie messages of businesses and services and products. Working with a fintech company here in the US as well, you would think it's all about data, it's all about the tech, there's not that much humanity about it. And yet we found that the most important value there was convenience and speed, and what that could do for families and for health, for well-being, etc. So once we had that value and those themes, we could find stories, personal stories that related to it, and that could really distinguish that fintech company from all the other fintech companies, because it's a huge booming kind of market right now. So yeah, those are just a few examples.
That's
Yeah.
absolutely true. I mean, just getting behind the abstractness of data and finance and find what's the human part of the product that you're touching, right?
Yeah.
Behind the cold numbers and the interest rates and things in a finance product, and
Yes.
speaking to the person at an emotional level, because I mean, you're always touching the person at a human level, and the idea really is to therefore find out what are those universal themes that you're talking about, and find the stories behind them, and then therefore you make a connection.
Mm-hmm.
So so speaking of, let's say, sales and presentation, Jerome, how does storytelling affect play a role in sales, for instance?
Yeah. Well, this might be also a good opportunity for me as I speak about sales in a particular topic like sales, to talk a little bit about some of the things that people who are listening here could do themselves, really. Because I think that, when you talk about sales, essentially what you're doing is you're trying to present a product or service, or even your company if you're a startup, and trying to get funding for it. You have to find that essential message, right? That's kind of marketing 101. Is what's that essential value proposition that I have? And so I would encourage people to look at, what is that value proposition that you've got? And by that, what I mean is, what's the value that you're really presenting here? Are you trying to, make a difference in people's lives? Are you trying to make something more convenient for people? What is that? If you were to boil it down to one or two words, what would be those key words? And in sales, that's what we try to find. Is it about convenience? Is it about speed? Is it about health? Is it, whatever that might be. And once we've got that, and we do exercises to kind of try to look for that, and usually we'll look at the product or service and we'll ask people, well, how do you talk about this product or service or company very naturally? Forget about the sales pitch. Forget about actually just what I said about the value proposition, just in your own words, right? And then let's look at that value proposition. Does it match how you really talk about it? And what's connected? What makes the connection between them? And, can you find one or two words that really define this, and that define not only what it means to you and the value to you, but what's the value to your audience, to your in storytelling, to your listener, but who's buying this product or service, and what's the value to them? Once you've got this kind of data that you look at, then you look at your own experiences, your life experiences. And in sales, we talk a lot about pain points. So I'm solving some kind of challenge for someone, right? If I go back to that fintech example, we were working with a sales team, for them, it was like, well, what's the pain point? It's inconvenient. For them, they were a business to business company, and they were a way to instantly get funding. So for example, if something happens to your house and there's a flood or something, then you will claim insurance, and you have insurance, then you will claim coverage with your insurance. The problem is that even if that claim is approved, it's going to take a while for the funds to get into your account. So what this company did is that they provide the insurance company with the means to make that claim go straight from approval to funding in less than 24 hours, and sometimes instantaneously. So that's their value proposition. Instead of having to wait around, you'll get it right away. Same thing with loans. You'll get a loan really, just like that. And so for them, it was about convenience. But then we looked at what's the underlying value of that? Like, why is convenience important to the people that work, that the end consumer who's actually going to get that loan? And someone said, well, I'm thinking of the single mother who doesn't know where the next check is going to come from, and she needs a very short-term loan, and she's been approved, but it's a Friday. And so as a result, her funds won't come in until Monday. And this is true. These are consumers of theirs. And so, I said, that's a great story, right? Because the pain point is that now there's something that's much more at stake than just, oh, well, this is nice to have because it's going to make my life a little bit easier. No, this is actually going to make my life way better, because suddenly it's the difference between me being able to go grocery shopping this weekend and feed my children or not. And so that's what we look for first, is what's at stake here? What's the pain point? And how do you relate to that pain point as a salesperson? Find experiences from your own life or from your clients. And if you don't have clients yet, if this is a brand new product, then use your own life experience. Many people in that group talked about times where they had issues with money. They couldn't have access to money. And this is ultimately what it was about. It was about getting access to money right away when you really need it the most, when something happens in your home, when there's a natural disaster, things that you didn't expect, right? So that's what you look for first in sales, is like, what's that pain point? And tell it to me in a very human way. And then you build your story around that so that you get to a point where it's like, now I can tell you how my product or service solves this. Because if you go right away into how your product or service solves a problem without spending any time telling me why I should care about the problem and why that problem is important, then I'm not going to listen to you. And I'm not going to care that much. It's either going to be, okay, yes, I can see the features of this product. They're exactly what I need. I'm going to buy it. But for some people who don't quite know yet that they need this, and that's most of us, we don't always know that we need something until somebody presents it to us. You know, we didn't know we needed an iPhone until Steve Jobs took it out of his pocket and said, hey, this is a phone. It's not an iPad. An iPod, you know, you can do everything on it. And then suddenly we're like, oh yes, we all need this, you know? And so it's the same thing. It's that sort of creating the dramatic build towards, you know, your solution, as opposed to right away telling me what your solution is and what your product features are. No, build the story. Tell me what the problem is. Why do I care about the story? How do you relate to that problem? You know, and then show me what your solution is, and let's have a dialogue about it.
That is like a snippet of a masterclass in sales storytelling.
True, absolutely. It's absolutely a good learning experience for us as well as our audience. I'm sure they're enjoying it. So we move on to as business leaders, as entrepreneurs, we have a passion. We are out to probably provide a service or offering a product to our customers, or we're also looking to hire some people and then even retain them. So that is sometimes an extremely critical thing, because at startups, sometimes you can't really afford the person that you are looking to hire, but still people join startups. So where do you think storytelling fits into the journey of an entrepreneur or a leader who's trying to motivate its people, who's trying to hire people and retain them?
Yeah. Well, I think there's another great question. You know, I think there's a real need for entrepreneurs to know what their story is, and I think there's a confusion between story and pitch, and so many entrepreneurs that I've met and worked with their startups, they sort of immediately tell me what their pitch is. So it's like, here's the problem, here's how we solve it, and here's how much we need, you know, to get this going, and here are the kinds of people that we need to hire, you know. So it's very sort of data based, and it's not particularly engaging, right? And so what I always ask is, well, how did you come up with this? Like, what was the thing? Again, I'm coming back to why story, why now? And as an entrepreneur, the question becomes, why me? Why now? Right? Because I'm the person who's running this thing. And as a result, anyone else who signs up with you, whether it's a customer or an employee, they're going to want to know who you are and how you're going to pull off this enterprise and where you're going to take them. So you have to be able to say, you know, I think every startup person that I've met, whether it's, I'm working with someone who deals with cybercrime right now and sort of cybersecurity, so very IT based. And there's a deep-seated belief, almost every, and then on the other end of the spectrum, someone who's working in social justice, you know, and kind of has a new venture around that. And each of them believes that they're changing the world, right? And so they will start at some point in their pitch, they will say, and that's how we're going to change the world. Now, the problem is, if you are an investor or if you're a client or if you're an employee, you've just come from 10 other startups who've told you they're going to change the world. And so how different is that, you know? And where the difference is in your own origin story, right? Where do you come from? Where do you come from with this problem, with this issue? And why did you come at it? And how did you come up with that solution? So we really want to know that journey about, you know, what was it? And sometimes, you know, it's someone who's, just to give you a really quick example here, you know, on the social justice issue, someone who was writing a book about all the inequalities in the justice system in the US many, many years ago, before what's going on right now. And she had this idea about 10 years ago based on what she saw. And this is how she told it to me. You know, she said, the problem is that I've come up with a system that's all about data and measuring the systems in each county of the USA so that we can finally have a system of checks and balances. And whenever I pitch this and I tell them this, you know, everyone's saying to me, yeah, it's interesting, but we don't really get why it's so important. And I said, well, that's because there's no story there. You need to tell me about what you saw when you went on that tour, about these inequalities. And it's, again, like the sales pitch, right? It's like, what's the problem here? Tell me what it is in human terms, you know. Same with cyber security. You know, what happens if there isn't security, you know, and tell me about that experience of someone breaching into a business and that business going down because of it, you know, because they're not able to pay for the costs of repairing what happened and the harm that was inflicted. So, you know, but if we don't know that on a personal level, then we're not going to respond to it. And people tend to just go straight to, I've got an idea that's going to change the world. No, again, build it. You have to build the story up so that we understand who you are and why you're the best positioned to do something. It'll work across the board for customers, for employees, for investors. They'll follow.
All the stakeholders, true.
Yeah.
So Jerome, in the webinars that Shruti and I have been conducting for the last few months, we found that every time we, you know, infused our communications with personal stories, the kind of the level of engagement and you know, with the audience just completely changes and goes up almost predictably today. And there's almost a perceptible emotional connection that happens. Would you be able to tell me what is it that's happening when that connection happens? You know, at the level of the brain, I think.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's scientific. I mean, we're actually hardwired for stories. And I think going back to what we said at the very beginning, what connects us all are stories. We don't just say that, you know, it's actually rooted in fact, in scientific fact. And they've done studies of the brain where they have put, you know, people through PET scans and MRIs and looked at the brain activity when someone listens to a story and when someone tells a story. And two different people at the same time. And if the one that's listening to a story has certain wires in their brain that are firing up, and you can just see it light up on the MRI, on the PET scan. And then the one telling stories, same thing. And the same areas of the brain are lighting up. So we know that there's a connection just on the brain level. And by the way we know this is that when people were not telling stories, those areas were not lighting up. The brain was just completely, nothing was happening. I mean, you were listening, but there was nothing, this is not a scientific term, but there was no excitement in the brain, you know, and the scientific term is wires that fire. No wires were firing, right? And so this is how we know that there's a connection to storytelling in the brain. We know it even further because people with brain damage who've been impacted in that area of the brain can no longer respond to stories or tell stories. They don't recognize a story. And so as a result, we know that there's a function of the brain that responds to story. And so that's why what you're talking about, Justin, is this very human thing that the moment we're in story mode, the brain recognizes it and it gets excited and it gets engaged. And if you start a story, if I say once upon a time, whoop, those wires are firing now, because we know that we're in story mode. And the brain is now expecting the story. So the danger is if you say, once upon a time I was walking down the street, and then you go out of story mode and into a more abstract conceptual thing of like, and that's how we're going to change the world, the brain stops firing. And then what happens emotionally is we get frustrated because we really wanted to know what was and then they lived happily ever after. We need the end. We need to know what happens next. We just can't help ourselves. So that's that enthusiasm that you're seeing, that connection, that emotional connection starts with the brain. And then the emotional connection happens because we're talking about human experience. And stories are necessarily emotional, right? Because we're touching on emotions that are universal to everyone.
I can imagine your workshops being great fun, Jerome.
Yes, And
So,
yours too.
so
Yeah.
can you tell us what happens that teach us a technique or two that you
Yeah.
apply in your workshop, and what are you coming up with in the near future that we could look at?
Yeah. Well, just building on what I just said about the brain, and that the brain recognizes when we're in story and it recognizes when we're not in story. So we took that and built a methodology around that idea. And we started looking at, well, what is a story? What makes a story compelling? And what really makes a story compelling, and this is for everyone to take home, is when you answer a simple question, which is what happened, right? And just say what happened to you. As if a camera was following you around, and that camera can see and it can hear, but it also has the three other senses, right? It can also touch, smell, and taste. So touch, smell, taste, see, hear. This is what I call sense-based storytelling. And it can also, this camera is also very smart because it can also see what happens in the body. So notice that when I told you about my experience, when my mother came back from that meeting and I had a knot in my stomach, what I didn't do is I did not tell you that I was nervous or anxious or anything like that, which are interpretive words. And they are abstract. It's your interpretation of something. And so for me, the listener, my brain is going to fire when I know that there's some sensory details. That's what we're looking for. You have to look for the sensory details in your story and just say what happened and move us along, right? The other thing I'll just say is that in terms of a story arc, what you're always looking for is what's at stake. When you answer, start by answering the question, why story, why now? Then think about kind of experiences you've got. Think about your listening and your listeners, what's important to them. And now you've found an experience, and now you want to tell a story, and you want to construct it as a story. So where do you begin? Where you begin with what's the problem here? What was the challenge, and why does it matter? That's what I call, that's to me the question, what's at stake? What are the stakes here? And so once you've got that, then you've got your beginning. And so I know that I can start somewhere. It's very important too to have is what I call an emotional turning point. That sort of thing where there was something that happened that was emotional in the story, whether it was for you or for somebody else. And finally, you end the story by resolving the problem you set up at the beginning, And all along the way, all you're doing is what happened. You're not saying at the end, and this is why we are the greatest. No, you're ending with, and now I am CEO of Narativ. Stop, right? Full stop, and now listen. Once you've told your story, listen to your audience, right? Just listen to that feedback, start the dialogue. Ask questions. Ask them, so what did you think of that story? What did that bring up for you, right? This is what we're looking for. We're looking for connection. We're not looking for the story, where we just drop the microphone and then we leave. That's it, folks. It's really a tool to connect. That's what we're looking to do. So I've given a few things. Hopefully that's, people can parse that out.
Fantastic. You've given us quite a bit to think about and chew on.
Yeah.
Jerome.
Yeah.
Let's take some questions. Shruti, what do you
Great.
Yes. Do we first want to talk about the next upcoming workshop from Narativ?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about that.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we've gone virtual, like many people and many businesses. We did this 3 years ago. We started doing workshops online, and the idea is for this one that we're running is to take what we do in terms of leadership development, and sort of demonstrating the values, your values as a leader. Or as an executive in a leadership position. Doesn't have to mean that you're a CEO, but some kind of leadership position, or maybe you're aspiring to become a leader of some kind or a manager of some kind. So that's who it's for. And we distilled our method into 3 90-minute sessions, which we're going to start in October next month. So there's a little bit of time. On October 14, it'll be 90-minute sessions each. And you can go to our website, narativ.com. You can use a special discount code, story10, story10. You know, I might even be able to put that in the chat box so that
That would be great.
people can, yeah, so that people can, I might have had this ready. What do you know? And so there we go.
Okay,
So
so
there you
should
go.
we move on to questions now?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
okay. So we have quite a few questions around the techniques of storytelling. So when we ask the audience to send us the questions through the form, we have a lot of people who are asking us that how do you really make the adults visualize, or how do you visualize the story so that they are not judgmental about the situation, or how do we not fall in the rut of being very preachy with our storytelling?
Yeah.
And the last one being how to really generate curiosity and anticipation around our stories. So these were some of the questions around the techniques of storytelling.
Great. I can definitely answer a few of these. I'm actually going to share my screen because I have a visual here that might be helpful to people. And you can see here, this is what I was talking about earlier, right? So that, how do I what was it? Curiosity and visualize, right? And avoiding the judgments of others. One of the things that I'm reading through the lines here, between the lines, is that often people ask me, how do I not come across as self-promotional or bragging if I'm telling a story of my own? And then how do I entice someone to want to know what's going to happen next? And I think that this is the foolproof methodology for it. Because if you just say what happened, what you heard, what you saw, what you tasted, what you smelled, what you touched, and you leave out your own interpretations and judgments and opinions about what happened, what you thought about what happened, what you felt about what happened, take those out and just say the facts, because nobody can argue with that, right? And actually, our brains crave that. This is how they're just going to follow along with you. You know, this is how I follow along with you. So that's the one thing. And then to generate curiosity, if you follow this simple arc here, you know, of just generating what's at stake, the emotional turning point, and the resolution, that emotional turning point is a moment of something that we didn't expect. So, you know, I heard a story before where, you know, what I was not expecting with the gentleman I was talking about earlier, Matt, and his father, I wasn't expecting that his father was going to have an accident. And he didn't say that at the beginning of his story. He said that that was his emotional turning point, right? And at that moment in the story, that piqued my curiosity, just as a listener, not as a coach, not as a professional storyteller, not as an expert, but really as a listener. Because I wanted to know, well, how is he going to get out of that situation? How is he going to feed his family? How is he going to get back to work? So I wanted to know what was going to happen next. So if you follow these simple tools, you can really, you know, be much more confident in bringing curiosity. But I would say the number one thing is to really try to avoid bringing your own opinions and interpretations and judgments, and trust the facts of the story. Just say what happened. That way, people will really want to follow you.
Wow, true. I will take one more question from my previous questions, then we move on to the questions that are coming in the chat box. There are a lot of storytellers in our group, and one very interesting question that came across is that how do we build a robust revenue model around storytelling? So how do we really pursue our business in storytelling?
Oh, great. Well, that's interesting. Yes, that's a question I'm always asking myself too, but especially these days. But we've been around for 20 years, so we've done a pretty good job of it, I think. For me, you know, what's really been helpful, and this is just from my own personal professional experience, you know, was being able to find a particular area as we moved along. Because at first we were offering storytelling applied to pretty much anything, because the truth is that it can be applied to anything. It can be applied to family relationships, you know, marriage relationships, everything. And we would do workshops that were open to everyone. And so everyone could come, didn't have to be a business person to do this. And it was great, you know, because it was sort of the burgeoning thing. But then once many, many other storytellers came in and many other companies came in, we had to sort of find another angle. And we really started to emphasize much more this aspect of listening, which really set us apart quite early on, because we really focus on that thing. So I think the more you can talk about what makes you different as a storyteller, it's like any other business. You know, people will gravitate towards that. And I'll just say from our experience in recent years, the last 5 years, we focused on one particular area of business, you know, specifically, where we've put much more attention. It's the area of onboarding. And, you know, what happens to new hires when they come into a business? And how do they get integrated into the culture of a business? And so we apply storytelling to that particular challenge because it is a very challenging piece, and very, there's a lot at stake there when someone, their first month, 2 months, they can make a lot of mistakes, they can feel alienated, like without a sense of belonging. And storytelling can really help to bring someone in and explain what their role is and create what's at stake for them, and why they're an important piece of this puzzle. So, but we had to sort of reinvent ourselves and find areas, little niches that we could focus on. And so that's, to me, the challenge for anyone who has a storytelling business, is that storytelling can be applied to anything. So you kind of have to, it'll benefit you if you can find an area of specialty or expertise.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, so we take a few questions from the chat. We have about 4 minutes to go now. We have a question.
CB Hari has got an interesting question, and he says, have you at any time just modified or changed your story based on the body language of the audience? So I would interpret that as, can you modify your story differently according to who your audience is, you know? So it does not, while it stays authentic at its core, you modify the fringes a little bit, depending on
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I have a great example of this. We were working once with a pharmaceutical company, and someone said, you know, a sales team, and you know, they said, we usually have an hour with a client. And I said, you know, is there anything that ever changes, you know, where that time gets truncated? I said, well, actually, about half of the time we come in and they say, sorry, you only have 5 minutes. So now your entire story has to change, right? And sometimes, and I think that's also to the question, you have to change it in the moment because you're noticing something about your audience. And I would say there's kind of two things that I'm looking at here. One is the scenario where I've only got 5 minutes. If you have your story structure and your arc, and you know what your milestones are, you know what your map is. We talk about a map, not about a script. If you've scripted every word, every comma, every period, you are in trouble. And you've learned it off by heart, you're in even more trouble. But if you have a map of your story, and someone tells you, and you've got a map for an hour, and now it's 5 minutes, if you know your beginning, your emotional turning point, and your end, you can tell it in 5 minutes. You can just go right there, right? The other thing is about body language in the moment. If you notice something happening in the moment, try to ask your audience if they're with you, right? Are you still with me? And maybe they'll tell you something like, I have terrible back pain today. I'm so sorry. I'm shifting in my seat. It's got nothing to do with you or your presentation. I'm very engaged and interested. Ask your audience. This has happened to me many, many times, where the body language is not at all about my story. It's not about my presentation. It's all about them. Maybe you need to take a 5-minute break, 30-second break. Maybe you need to stretch. You know, engage your audience that way. Ask questions.
True. I think we have another very interesting question where it says, when did you, this is from Sunil, which says that when did you discover the power of stories, and who is the best storyteller that impacted you?
Wow. So many. Well, I come from a film background, you know, in terms of storytelling. So definitely there are many filmmakers that have impacted me, you know, and so I would say that, you know, one of the, I still to this day am in awe of the movie Jaws. And, you know, Steven Spielberg is definitely one of the great storytellers. You know, in terms of oral storytelling and presenters, I definitely think that Steve Jobs was a master storyteller. Not because he told great stories, even though he did. And if you want an example of that, you can see his commencement speech, which has many millions of views on YouTube at Stanford. Just type Steve Jobs' Stanford commencement speech, and you'll see it. And he
Yeah.
brings himself into it. And but really, because he used storytelling principles. This map that I'm talking about, he didn't have to tell a story every time, but he knew what a good beginning was, and he knew how to end a presentation so that people were excited and they were called into action, right? So those are some of the kinds of people. When did I find out about the power of story? I think probably the first time I went to see a movie, which was The Return of the Jedi, when I was 8 years old. You know, that to me was the power of story in action. And then I found ways to engage with it.
Cool, wonderful. We absolutely enjoyed, and we almost running out of time. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks Jerome for answering so many questions for us. We have made we've had a wonderful time asking you all these questions. In case anyone still has any questions and you've not been able to take them over, you can probably find Jerome on LinkedIn.
Yes.
You can find us on LinkedIn. We can try and answer some questions. So thank you everyone. Thanks for coming over, and thanks for joining us.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I just shared my email in the chat as well. So feel free to email me if you have any questions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Shruti.
Fabulous.
Thank you, Jerome. See you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.